I know some people are, I got a couple people who are registering across the state and
Oh, good.
exciting. Hi, Kelly. Yeah, it's exciting to have, that's one of the advantages of doing Zoom is that we get
Hmm.
people from all over the state or country or world.
Right.
We're really big in Europe.
Really?
Just kidding.
Well, you never know.
You
Maybe you
never
should
know.
be.
I know, right? I know. That's a line from one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite Cameron Crowe movies called Singles from the 90s. It was a 1990s movie,
Oh, okay.
Singles. And it's, you know, basically these bands who are Seattle bands. It's like the Seattle band scene, and they're not famous at all, but they tell people they're really big in Europe.
Well, if I'd have seen the movie, I probably would have got the reference.
Yeah. All right. So we do have, it is noon right now, straight up 12 o'clock. Um, we do have about 9 people signed up. So I'll a couple minutes to see if anybody else joins. So I'm going to give it one more minute and then we'll start. I can also admit people as we're going. Some people are late. Thanks for joining us today. Hi, Charlie. Just gonna give a couple more, just a little bit left here before we're gonna start. I don't wanna, we had 9 people signed up, so looks like a couple people haven't signed in yet. I'm just gonna give it a few more seconds. All right, well, thanks everybody for joining. This is our second virtual Lunch and Learn. I am going to be recording the presentation just so that we can send it out to those who registered who weren't able to attend. And during the question and answers, if you want to, if you don't mind your video being on the recording, you can turn your video on. If you do mind, feel free to turn your video off. I'm hoping that this presentation will take about 45 minutes so that we can have the last 15 minutes for questions and answers. So if you have a question, feel free to just write it down so that you don't forget, so that you can ask it at the end. All right, I'm just gonna share my screen now. Hopefully everyone can see it. All right. So today we're talking about Domestic Violence 101, the basics of domestic violence. And my name is Jenny Jo Allen. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator for ASPEN. And as you can see here, ASPEN is an acronym that stands for Abuse Support and Prevention Education Network. So what we do, we have two branches, if you want to think of it as like an aspen grove, and we have the network is the canopy of leaves, and then we have a branch of abuse support. We do have a shelter, a 10-bed shelter that we can help people who are trying to get away from their abuser. We also can put people in hotels if it's something where they just need to get away and it's the middle of the night and we don't want to, upset the other residents of the shelter. So we do provide shelter in those ways. And then we also have a 24-hour a day, 7-day a week, 365 days out of the year support line. And that number is listed there. People can call anytime, even if they're not ready to leave their abuser, if they just want to talk and get support and create a safety plan and get resources. We do a lot of referrals with our abuse support branch of services. We're very connected to the communities we work in. We work in Park, Sweetgrass, and Marr counties. So if anyone, a lot of times we'll get people who are new to the area or who are maybe just moving through the area who don't know about the resources that we have in our communities. And so we offer referrals to those places. And then we also have advocacy, and this is really the type of connection that we have with our survivors of domestic violence. This is the branch, the part of the abuse support branch that is more of a long-term advocacy. Even if they don't use our shelter, or if they don't need shelter, a lot of times they need the advocacy. They need someone that can help them navigate the legal system with orders of protection and things like that. And so that's a huge part of that abuse support as well. And then the education is abuse prevention education, and we do we follow the model of the CDC's primary prevention model. So we really try to intervene before abuse happens. So with our prevention, we offer trainings for young children, schools, preschools, teaching children how to learn about boundaries and consent and kindness and empathy. And then the older kids, we teach about dating abuse, sexual assault, and prevention methods for those things as well. So what is domestic violence? This is the definition here. And the really important thing to remember with this definition is the power and control. Power and control. Abuse is about power and control. So in domestic violence, it's willful intimidation, physical assault, battery, sexual assault, and or other abusive behavior as part of a systematic pattern of power and control perpetrated by one intimate partner against another. So when we're working with prevention, one of the best ways to have primary prevention against abuse is to teach people how those systematic patterns of power and control can affect another person. And so with domestic violence, we are talking about interrelationship violence. So it is one intimate partner against another. So in something like bullying that comes up a lot with in schools, that it's not technically domestic violence, but it is a type of violence that we want to end because it can lead to intimate partner violence in those types of relationship, because it's the same type of use of power and control against another person. Domestic violence can also include sexual violence. Emotional abuse is a huge part of domestic violence. It is oftentimes the emotional abuse can be very mild in the beginning. Gaslighting, if people have heard that term, gaslighting, it is where somebody is basically making you think you're crazy when you notice things about the other person being abusive. If you bring it up and say, hey, you know what, I don't like the way you're doing XYZ, and that person says, oh, you're just crazy, oh, you're too sensitive, and basically putting it on you, like you're the one that has the problem. That can be a huge part of domestic violence, and it really affects the victim's mindset, so that they start to believe that it is they're the ones that have a problem, that it's them who is crazy or too sensitive or blowing things out of proportion. And so that can be a component of domestic violence. It usually is, even when there's not physical violence or sexual violence, there's usually emotional abuse. And it can be really scary, especially when there are threats involved. It can feel, the person can feel really isolated and feel like their life is in danger. The frequency and severity of domestic violence can really vary. And one of the things that has happened in Montana, just to kind of bring it back to Montana, is in the Bakken region, according to a Department of Justice funded study, domestic violence, dating violence, and sexual assault have increased substantially due to the recent oil boom in the Bakken. From 2005 to 2014, the rate of incidents reported to the National Incident-Based Reporting System increased from less than 50 per 10,000 to over 70 per 10,000. And there were more victims from out of state, more victims had limited English proficiency. The violence was more severe. Victims and survivors were more isolated and had fewer financial resources. A lot of them experienced homelessness. Many experienced multiple victimizations and had repeat perpetrators. And the shelters in the area were really overburdened, and the providers were not able to keep up with the need for services. So when we're thinking of Montana and we're thinking of domestic violence, there are some vulnerabilities in certain areas, and the rural areas can be more susceptible to that isolation that can sometimes lead to the victim not getting the help that they need. And just to kind of give you an idea of the most severe form of domestic violence is domestic homicide. Between the years 2000 and 2006, so in 6 years, 3,200 American soldiers were killed, And during that same period of time, domestic homicide claimed 10,600 lives. So you can see that it can be a very, very severe form of abuse, causing death. These are some other domestic violence statistics in Montana. And just to kind of put it in perspective, 39.2% of Montana women and 32.6% of Montana men experience intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner sexual violence, and or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. That's almost half of both men and women. So 39.2% of women and 32.6% of Montana men. And this is what's being reported. So usually reporting rates are lower than what's actually happening. So you round it up to 40% of women and 30% of men. That's a lot. We have that's a very high rate of domestic violence. And the murder suicides that we've had in our state, 72% of them, and this is from statistics from 2016. It's the most recent statistics I could get on these numbers. But 72% of all murder suicides involved an intimate partner. Another thing that we don't have a lot of in Montana, but one of the national statistics on domestic violence shows that mass shootings are often perpetrated by domestic violence abusers, and they start off by murdering their partner and then end up shooting others as well. And so just to keep that in mind, the abuser's access to firearms increases the risk of intimate partner femicide at least fivefold. So that's the man or the intimate partner murdering the woman. Just having that access to the firearms increases it by five times. So that's a huge increase. The definition of physical abuse: any intentional and unwanted contact with victim's body by the abuser or an object. So if the person is hitting them with something. The most lethal form of physical abuse is strangling. And verbal emotional abuse is anything the abuser says or does to the victim to incite fear. Again, it's lower their self-esteem or manipulate or attempt to control the victim's feelings and behaviors. And again, it's that control, that power and control. So a lot of times the phone, cell phones can be used to control a victim as well, or try to control a victim as well, checking in excessively with the person, or even there's been this increase of people wanting to have the abuser telling their victim that they have to send pictures of where they're at, not just texting them, but actually sending pictures to verify that they're in the place that they say they are if they're not home. And then sexual abuse is any sexual behavior that is unwanted or interferes with the victim's right to say no. And a lot of domestic violence survivors have reported sexual abuse, within their abusive relationship. Oftentimes it does involve unwanted pregnancies, their partner not using protection or not allowing them to use birth control. And then, of course, economic and financial abuse, that's something when the victim is restrained. You know, a lot of times people will think that because the victim is working, that they have the financial ability to leave their abuser. But sometimes because of that power and control, they don't have access to the money, even their own paycheck, even their own money that they earn. Oftentimes they won't have that. And oftentimes victims are not, you know, they're controlled to the point where they're not even allowed to go to work or make an income for themselves. This is our the violence, power, and control wheel. And so this kind of shows you how different, how much power and control has to do with abuse. And whenever you're thinking of abuse, you can just think of it as power and control. If there's an imbalance of power, a misuse of power, someone trying to control another person, it's abusive. If you'd like copies of the handouts, I can send those to you as well. Just send me an email and I'll get those copies to you. Because this one, there's a lot to read there. And it does say her, putting her down, preventing her from getting a job, that stuff. But this also happens, domestic violence also happens to people who identify as male. And it's really important to know that a lot of times they don't report because of the stigma that we have in our society that men don't get abused by women, but they do. And so even though this says her on there, it can be a man as well, or someone who identifies as male. Versus, so that was a power and control wheel, and this is the equality wheel. So as you can see in the equality wheel, we have fairness, we have respect, shared responsibility, economic partnership, equity. And so this is what we are going for, what we're striving to have. And this is what, when I'm teaching healthy relationship lessons to youth, this is what we go by, is the nonviolent equality wheel. One of the things I use with youth too is are you having fun in the relationship? Because that's really important. If you're not having fun, then kind of looking at that and wondering why. Like, you know, okay, he's texting you constantly, or she's texting you constantly, she's checking up on you. Is that fun? Are you having fun with that? And if they say no, then it's like, okay, that's worth looking into. This is the cycle that happens with violence often. There is tension that builds up, that walking on eggshells feeling, that usually when victims of domestic violence are in that place where they are feeling like they're walking on eggshells, it's that thinking that, well, last time I know I set him off because I woke him up when I was doing the dishes. So this time I'll be really super quiet when I'm washing the dishes, or thinking that they can control the other person's outbursts. And so there's that trying to reason and figure out, like, oh, what can I do to not make that happen? Should I just not talk? Or maybe if being quiet makes them mad, I'm gonna talk a lot. But then it eventually, that tension builds to the point of explosion, and there is abuse. And they have on this sheet, they call it batterer. We usually say abuser and not batterer, because it's not always the the physical violence. It could be name calling, it could be humiliation, it could be threats. We're going to watch a video and a clip in just a little bit, and the woman who we're going to watch, her abuser used to hold a loaded gun to her head. So there wasn't any, she wasn't being hurt physically, but that threat that she could be killed with just a pull of a trigger kept her from being able to do anything. She was terrified. She's terrified to even move or breathe. So that's that explosion. And oftentimes the victim will call the police. I mean, that does happen. And sometimes there's an intervention there at that level, but not always. Sometimes they feel like they can talk the person out of it or calm them down. And then the honeymoon period, we all know what this is. That's where the person's very sorry and tries to make amends. And this is the, when we're going to be talking about the shifting of the paradigm away from victim blaming. And in the honeymoon period, this is where the person who is the perpetrator of violence could, oftentimes will set up a counseling appointment or go to anger management or something. That part, when they are seeing that there's a problem and they're wanting to work on that, that is a really important part of intervention that in our community, we could use more resources. We could use more support for those people who are truly realizing that they have an issue with their anger and that they have issues with power and control and they want to get help. So there's some myths around domestic violence. It's not only married couples who can be charged with partner family members, all domestic violence charges, or that it happens to. It can happen in any intimate relationship. And it often happens in young relationships. Women are most likely to get in an abusive relationship between the ages of 16 and 24. So that is usually, they're not usually married. Oftentimes it's just an intimate partner that sometimes they're living with, sometimes they're not. Poverty and alcohol cause domestic violence. There might be a correlation, but there's not a causal relationship there. The only thing that causes domestic violence is the abuser abusing, period. That's it. That's what causes domestic violence, is the abuser choosing to abuse. And you'll hear a lot of times, well, he just lost control. But it's not about that, because if they just lost control and they couldn't control themselves, then when the police showed up, they would still be not able to control themselves. And yet oftentimes the appearance of an authority figure like police will, then the person is no longer abusive in front of that officer. So that shows you right there, it's not about losing control, it's about choosing to abuse. And so that's again one of those paradigm shifts that we have to come to. It's not because they were drunk, it's not because they lost control, it's because they chose to abuse. The alcohol can definitely impact that choice, but it is their choice ultimately. Rape is sexual intercourse without consent, and marriage does not equal consent. Neither does dating someone. Neither does consenting to sex at one time does not mean that you're consenting every single time. Consent is each and every time. And domestic violence in same-sex relationships isn't as bad, and that is simply not true. Abuse in same-sex relationships is just as severe as abuse in opposite-sex relationships, and the statistics are very close to each other with frequency as well. So this is where we're going to get into really what I'd like to talk about most today, which is, why do victims stay? That question in and of itself is victim blaming. It's saying that basically this person is choosing to be abused by staying. That's kind of the way that it comes across. So let's talk about how difficult it is to leave an abusive relationship. One of the things in our society's listed as one of the things here, and one of the things with our society is we put a lot of emphasis on commitment, and when we're in a marriage especially, but any committed relationship, there's that emphasis of like making it work. When you're in a committed relationship, making it work and making sure that you do everything you can to make that relationship work. So there's that societal pressure, and there's love. These relationships don't just happen after the first date. It doesn't become abusive right away. So love has developed usually in these relationships. People love their partners. And when you love someone and you're committed to them, our society says you don't give up. You don't just give up on that. You stick it out and you work on it and you do the work. Sometimes it's hard work in a relationship. So that can be a huge barrier to leaving. One of the other barriers to leaving that is very serious is that fear of safety. The most dangerous time for a victim is when they leave. So a victim of domestic violence is when they are attempting to leave. That can be the most dangerous time, the most fatal time for them. So one of the things we do at Aspen when we have people come to us for help is we safety plan, and we make sure that they have a safety plan in place, whether they're leaving or not. We just want to make sure that they have that safety plan in place and they've thought of these things. So children and pets can also be a barrier to leaving, especially if it's a small town, and your children have grown up there. You don't want to have to take them out of their school and their community where they've lived, and yet you can't imagine living in the same community with your abuser because he's so controlling. So there are a lot of aspects that that go along with why a victim stays or why they don't leave. We're going to watch a little clip about that right now. This is the author, Leslie Morgan Steiner. She's the author of Crazy Love. And I'm just going to set it up, get it to the right spot here.
About domestic violence, its warning signs or its patterns. I met Connor on a cold, rainy January night. He sat next to me on the New York City subway, and he started chatting me up. He told me two things. One was that he too had just graduated from an Ivy League school, and that he worked at a very impressive Wall Street bank. But what made the biggest impression on me that first meeting was that he was smart and funny, and he looked like a farm boy. He had these big cheeks, these big apple cheeks, and this wheat blonde hair, and he seemed so sweet. One of the smartest things Connor did from the very beginning was to create the illusion that I was the dominant partner in the relationship. He did this, especially at the beginning, by idolizing me. We started dating, and he loved everything about me. That I was smart, that I'd gone to Harvard, that I was passionate about helping teenage girls and my job. He wanted to know everything about my family and my childhood, my hopes and dreams. Connor believed in me as a writer and a woman in a way that no one else ever had. And he also created a magical atmosphere of trust between us by confessing his secret, which was that as a very young boy, starting at age 4, he had been savagely and repeatedly physically abused by his stepfather. And the abuse had gotten so bad that he had had to drop out of school in 8th grade, even though he was very smart. And he'd spent almost 20 years rebuilding his life, which is why that Ivy League degree and the Wall Street job and his bright, shiny future meant so much to him. If you had told me that this smart, funny, sensitive man who adored me would one day dictate whether or not I wore makeup, how short my skirts were, where I lived, what jobs I took, who my friends were, and where I spent Christmas, I would have laughed at you. Because there was not a hint of violence or control or anger in Connor at the beginning. I didn't know that the first stage in any domestic violence relationship is to seduce and charm the victim. I also didn't know that the second step is to isolate the victim. Now, Connor did not come home one day and announce, hey, all this Romeo and Juliet stuff has been great, but I need to move into the next phase where I isolate you and I abuse you. So I need to get you out of this apartment where the neighbors can hear you scream, and out of this city where you have friends and family and coworkers who can see the bruises. Instead, Connor came home one Friday evening, and he told me that he had quit his job that day, his dream job. And he said that he had quit his job because of me, because I had made him feel so safe and loved that he didn't need to prove himself on Wall Street anymore. And he just wanted to get out of the city and away from his abusive, dysfunctional family and move to a tiny town in New England where he could start his life over with me by his side. Now, the last thing I wanted to do was leave New York and my dream job. But I thought you made sacrifices for your soulmate. So I agreed, and I quit my job, and Connor and I left Manhattan together. I had no idea I was falling into crazy love, that I was walking headfirst into a carefully laid physical, financial, and psychological trap. The next step in the domestic violence pattern is to introduce the threat of violence and see how she reacts. And here's where those guns come in. As soon as we moved to New England, that place where Connor was supposed to feel so safe, he bought 3 guns. He kept one in the glove compartment of our car. He kept one under the pillows on our bed. And the third one he kept in his pocket at all times. And he said that he needed those guns because of the trauma he'd experienced as a young boy. He needed them to feel protected. But those guns were really a message for me. And even though he hadn't raised a hand to me, my life was already in grave danger every minute of every day. Connor first physically attacked me 5 days before our wedding. It was 7 a.m. I still had on my nightgown. I was working on my computer trying to finish a freelance writing assignment, and I got frustrated. And Connor used my anger as an excuse to put both of his hands around my neck and to squeeze so tightly that I could not breathe or scream. And he used the chokehold to hit my head repeatedly against the wall. 5 days later, the 10 bruises on my neck had just faded, and I put on my mother's wedding dress, and I married him. Despite what had happened, I was sure we were going to live happily ever after, because I loved him, and he loved me so much. And he was very, very sorry. He had just been really stressed out by the wedding and by becoming a family with me. It was an isolated incident, and he was never going to hurt me again. It happened twice more on the honeymoon. The first time, I was driving to find a secret beach, and I got lost. And he punched me in the side of my head so hard that the other side of my head repeatedly hit the driver's side window. And then a few days later, driving home from our honeymoon, he got frustrated by traffic, and he threw a cold Big Mac in my face. Connor proceeded to beat me once or twice a week for the next 2.5 years of our marriage. I was mistaken in thinking that I was unique and alone in this situation. 1 in 3 American women experiences domestic violence or stalking at some point in her life. And the CDC reports that 15 million children are abused every year. 15 million. So actually, I was in very good company. Back to my question. Why did I stay? The answer is easy. I didn't know he was abusing me, even though he held those loaded guns to my head, pushed me downstairs, threatened to kill our dog, pulled the key out of the car ignition as I drove down the highway, poured coffee grinds on my head as I dressed for a job interview. I never once thought of myself as a battered wife. Instead, I was a very strong woman in love with a deeply troubled man, and I was the only person on earth who could help Connor face his demons. The other question everybody asks is, why doesn't she just leave? Why didn't I walk out? I could have left any time. To me, this is the saddest and most painful question that people ask, because we victims know something you usually don't. It's incredibly dangerous to leave an abuser, because the final step in the domestic violence pattern is kill her. Over 70% of domestic violence murders happen after the victim has ended the relationship, after she's gotten out, because then the abuser has nothing left to lose. Other outcomes include long-term stalking, even after the abuser remarries, denial of financial resources, and manipulation of the family court system to terrify the victim and her children, who are regularly forced by family court judges to spend unsupervised time with the man who beat their mother. And still we ask, why doesn't she just leave?
So I showed you that just to give you the perspective of a survivor, and why that question is, we need to flip that around and really think about like how we can support survivors in our community. LGBTQ plus survivors they have unique challenges. One of the things that happens often with LGBTQ plus survivors is that they can be, there's that threat of outing them that can be held over their heads. A lot of times people will say like, you know, if you don't do XYZ, then I'll out you, and use that as a coercion or a threat to keep the person from getting help. So 45% of victims do not report the violence they experience to police because they believe it will not help them. 45% of the LGBTQ survivors, that is almost half of the people who do not report. And so one of the things that's also interesting that kind of goes along with this is the National National Instant Criminal Background Check, the NICS index. That's a location where when people do report the domestic violence misdemeanors and protective orders can be put in there so that when people have criminal background checks, those things will pop up. But as of December 31st, 2015, Montana had submitted only 2 domestic violence misdemeanors and 0 protective orders into the NICS index. So that feeling of, with LGBTQ survivors of like, they feel like they are not going to be helped by the police. One of the things that kind of contributes to that is the systems that are in place maybe not protecting them in the past. So here are some of the more of the specific issues. I already talked about the threatening to out somebody. We do shelter people who are LGBTQ plus if they are trans or non-binary and they don't feel comfortable being in our safe house. We can definitely house them in another shelter, another way of sheltering them. We never turn anyone away for that, of course. We're very inclusive. So if anybody is LGBTQ and comes to us and needs shelter, we will make sure that they're comfortable and feel safe where they're at. So some of the impacts of domestic violence, these are just some of them that can happen. And a lot of times these things don't even show up right away, like the PTSD. Sometimes things will come out through over the years, even months or years later after they are out of the domestic violence cycle. Though oftentimes other things will show up. Things like panic attacks and sexual dysfunction, things like that can also have lasting impacts. And, you know, probably most of us on this session have probably heard of the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. If you haven't, definitely check that out, because it does talk about the health impacts of domestic violence and other types of adverse childhood experiences. But domestic violence, or witnessing their parent being abused, especially their mother. So I keep talking about the paradigm shift. So one of the things that we can do as a society to help shift the blame away from victims is to have services and programs in our communities that engage men in violence prevention. Aspen has been started working with the high schools last year, Park High School, to bring Coaching Boys into Men, which is a program. It's the only evidence-based program that shows that working with boys to help prevent violence and becoming abusers in the future, it has that evidence-based background. That program was studied by the CDC for 3 years, and they found that it increased bystander intervention with boys by 67%. It also increased their comprehension of what constituted abuse, so that they could be sure that they did not become abusive. So, and the other thing is ending poverty. Poverty is one of the things, again, it doesn't cause domestic violence, but when a person is not able to have financial stability on their own, it can really impact their ability to have independence and not be controlled or have that imbalance of power with somebody who does have that financial stability. The Survivor Alliance is a great organization that we have in our country, and it helps survivors who, say, were in an abusive relationship for their majority of their adult life, and they are getting out. It helps them by giving them the education and the training they need to be able to be financially independent. And increased survivor agency, that's just part of that, you know, being able to help the survivor do things on their own and be independent and be and thrive on their own is really huge. So having programs like Aspen that can help them link to resources and start a new life without the abuser, you know, links to resources like therapy, where they can really figure out how they can be stronger and have agency in their life. And then restorative justice, that is something that can really help get to the bottom of the abuser's issues. Like when an abuser is in a restorative justice program, they really address what issues they have to hopefully end that cycle of violence. Here are some resources for survivors in our area in Park County. We have Southwest Chemical Dependency, and they don't have a website, but that's their phone number. So if you call them, they can help you. And the L'Esprit that's listed under Mental and Behavioral Health Services, they are actually also in the works of hiring a licensed addictions counselor. So you could call them too for chemical dependency. And I'm not sure if that program is up and running yet, but I know that they will help you as well if you know anyone who needs to get help in that area. And we work a lot with HRDC. They're a wonderful organization that helps with housing, and they also have other programs like senior programs that are really great, and then food resources. We have a lot more resources in our resource guide. So if you would like me to email you a copy of our resource guide, we can do that too. Just shoot me an email, and that's JENNYJO@ASPENMT.org, and I can send you that resource guide. Thank you very much for attending. I'm going to go ahead and open it to questions. Let's see here. I don't think there's anything on here that needs explaining. Those are just all of our handles for our social media, our locations and stuff like that. So yeah, feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions.
Jenny Jo, you mentioned early on that you have 10 beds. What about people with children?
Mm-hmm.
I assume that you help people with children. Are they usually put in a hotel, or do they go to your shelters, or how does that work?
It really depends. We have Kelly is actually on our line. She's our shelter manager, and each individual case is addressed individually. So it really depends on the needs of the people in the shelter already. We are also having a lot more distancing because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So even though we have a 10-bed shelter, right now we're not being able to utilize it the same way because we can't have the community space, living spaces have had to change. So we are utilizing hotels a lot more now. But what we would suggest is to just have the person call us, and they can ask, we can go through a screening with them to see if they would qualify for our shelter program. And that's what we try to call it, a shelter program, because that way it lets them see that it's not just about getting into the safe house. We might be sheltering them in a different way. And also we also help them transition as much as we can into whatever way that they want to be in the community. So sometimes people, we've had some people who are disabled and aren't maybe looking for a job, but then we've had other people who were like, I want a career and this is what my degree is in, and there's, help linking them to job service to work on those things. Or, we've had sometimes people with multiple children that it just wouldn't be feasible to put them in shelter.
Yeah, and actually, Jenny Jo, if you wouldn't mind letting me, and actually when we say 10 bed, we mean that we can house 10 people. And so we have 3 bedrooms. The house is an actual house that has 3 bedrooms. And one of those bedrooms is a family room. So it's got a large queen size bed. It's got a set of bunk beds and another twin bed. So that's where we stick the larger families. And then we also have another room that we've been using for our individuals. But if we get a family, which we actually have now, we turn that singles room into another large family room. Right now with COVID, we were in the past having people share rooms, but now we are not. So each family, right now we have 3 families, and each family goes in their own room. And so we kind of will adjust those singles rooms to turn into family rooms so they can, so they'll all stay. And then we have one smaller room that we usually save. Right now we're saving for an individual who can't do the stairs at the house, or if they have a young child, a young infant, and we don't want to try to keep all the rest of the family members up all night, we'll put them in that room. So we have 3 bedrooms, and we just kind of utilize it just like how Jenny Jo said, depending on the need and who comes and where we can make everyone fit and be happy.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And there's also oftentimes the people, we'll have sometimes people who are not from the area. So, I think that there's this idea that like Montana's the safe place, that we're far away from everything and we're safe from things. And then sometimes when people get here, they're like, I don't think I want to live here after all. Like, this is really isolated. Or so we can also help link them to others. Like if they are like, yeah, this is really not the area I want to be in after all, or or maybe they are from here and they want to get away from their abuser, far away from their abuser. We can help link them to other shelters as well. So that's kind of like that shelter program. It's not necessarily always our shelter or our safe house. It can be sheltering them in whatever way fits their needs best.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. So it looks like Lauren, I see your question, how long is the average stay in the shelter? So we do have a 45-day limit, but that's really us kind of a what we gauge is the person working on their treatment plan. Are they moving forward with finding a place? As you know, in Livingston, we have an affordable housing crisis in this country. And so if the person has not been able to secure that housing and they are still needing to stay with us, they can. They have to just fill out an extension form. And if there are issues where the person is, say that they move in and they have everything in place, they have a job, they have money, they have this and that, and they just needed a shelter for a couple of weeks to get a place or something like that, that's fine too. It's not like they have to stay a minimum of 45 days. I think the average, Kelly, do we have an average of how long that they stay?
Yeah, usually we get them they usually stay for about 2 to 3 months, and we've had people stay as long as 6 months just because they have they've already gotten a job and gotten to a place where they feel safe from their abuser, but there's literally no housing. And so they're basically just waiting for HRDC to help or get on top of the Timberline list. So they usually stay probably about 2 to 3 months.
And that's, we can be really creative too with them as far as finding a housing, because sometimes, it might not be an apartment or a rental house. It might be a trailer, or a mobile home. So. All right, well, thank you all. If there are no more questions, if you have any questions you'd like to have answered privately, feel free to email me. If you'd like those, the power and control wheel and the equality wheel handouts, please go ahead and, email me and I'll send you whatever handouts for that. And I really appreciate everybody joining today for the virtual lunch and learn. I can't wait until we can be back face to face and eat food together. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.